Today we're going to start a series entitled Finding Your Way Back to God. Finding Your Way Back to God. Now the sermon series is based on a book by that same title. So if you want to go to Amazon, you want to get Finding Your Way Back to God. I forgot to bring the authors' names, but I think you'd be blessed by the book. But the book examines 5 awakenings that the prodigal son had on his way back to God. Or back to the Father. And to be quite honest, these 5 awakenings really apply to all of us. This is where all of us find ourselves, somewhere in the midst of these 5 awakenings. Now, before I jump right into the sermon, let me just say that because you are here doesn't mean that you don't need to get closer to God. I don't want you to check out this morning. I want you to pay attention, because even though you may be close to God, even though you're a child of God, there is always room for us to get closer to Him. There's always things we can do to draw nearer to Him. And so do not check out on me this morning. This will be applicable to you as it was to me, or as it is to me. And I think that is why the story of the prodigal son is so powerful. Because the truth is, it really crosses all cultures, all times, and it applies to every single one of our lives. We have all found ourselves where the prodigal was. His situation is our situation. That may be why Charles Dickens wrote about the prodigal son that it was the greatest short story ever. So, what will this powerful story tell us this morning? As we gaze into a mirror of our own lives, really, what is it going to teach us today? What can we learn about our journeying closer to God and the journey that others are on as they try to seek Him too? That's what I want you to think about as we start to read this story. It is in Luke chapter 15, if you're not aware of that. Luke chapter 15, we find this story, the story of the lost son, the story of the prodigal son. And this is what it says, starting in verse 11. It says, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them." I want to stop there for a second. As we read this text, I think it's important that we understand that right off the get-go, right from the very beginning, the younger son, the prodigal son, he insults his father. Right from the get-go, he insults his father. See, Jewish custom was that the son was to take care of his aging parents. So for him to say, I want my inheritance now, it was like to say, well, I'm not really worried about you when you get old. Plus, to be quite honest, it was essentially saying, I don't care if you live or die. The only thing I really want is what I can get out of you. And so right off the bat, we start off with this insult. And the son says, give me my inheritance right now. Moving on, verse 13, it says, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had. He set off for a distant country and there squandered his wealth in wild living. I want to stop there for a second. Wild living. I want you to think about that for a minute. Wild living. This younger son, he goes out and he says, I'm going to use all the money my dad just gave me, and I'm going to use it for wild living. Who would do such a thing? Yet I know a man that when he was 19 years old, he moved 500 plus miles away from his parents. He got an apartment with a friend of his. And they threw themselves into all sorts of wild living. They made all sorts of wrong choices. Their pursuit pretty much every night of the week was to find the next party they could be involved with. And like the prodigal, this man knew what a loving father was like. But in his selfishness, he had placed pleasure as his number one priority over all things, just like the son in our text this morning. Now let me read you most of the story. Verses 14 through 24, this is what he says. After he had spent everything on wild living, there was a severe famine in the whole country and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." The prodigal son, he returned. The young man I mentioned earlier, he eventually woke up. Literally, he woke up from a terrible nightmare. In his nightmare, he had dreamed that he had gone to hell. And he knew that if he stayed on the path that he was on, that's exactly where he would end up. And it scared him so badly that he quit his job, he packed up his things, he called his parents and asked if he could come home, and he left. That day, he left. How did the prodigal and how did this young man get to this point? The truth is, it all started when they thought to themselves 5 little words: there's got to be more. 5 little words had essentially taken them on a journey they did not really want to go on. Those 5 little words have sent mankind down all sorts of wrong paths at one time or another. Those 5 little words have started wars and ended sobriety. Those 5 little words have destroyed families and blew up careers. And to be quite honest, those 5 little words have filled the pews of churches across this world. Now, before you think too badly of those 5 little words, there's got to be more. The truth is that they aren't always bad words. In fact, the idea that there's got to be more to this life is exactly what you and I should be thinking. It is a longing that I believe God has placed in our hearts, that there's got to be something better, that there has to be more than this. In fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, it says, talking about God, He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, or in the human heart. I think speaking to the fact that there is essentially this God-shaped hole in our heart that we try to fill with stuff, and He's all the time saying, there's more. Just turn to me and find it. There's more. See, today's awakening is that we should be longing for something more. We should be longing for something more. The problem is that in that longing, so often we run away from God instead of toward God. And God is the only one who can really, truly satisfy our longings. And like the prodigal, we need to realize that we can only find what we're looking for when we return to the Father. So this morning I want to look at some longings. And these aren't all the longings you might have. These are probably not even all the longings that the prodigal had. But in these longings, I believe that we realize that God is the only one who truly satisfies them. So what longings does God satisfy for us? And the first is this: God satisfies our longing for love. God satisfies our longing for love. Now our text, at least the part of the text that we read, really didn't tell us what wild living consisted of. But the older brother rats his younger brother out in verse 30 of the same chapter. He says, but when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. We really hadn't seen what the younger brother had done. We kind of knew in our minds, but the older brother, he says, he was out there with prostitutes. See, this man was looking for love in all the wrong places. You got it? You know that song. You're with me. He had to be thinking to himself, I can't get no satisfaction. All right, we're still there. The rest of the sermon is all in song lyrics. No, it's not. But I tried and I tried and I tried and I tried. Really, this young man's predicament reminds me of a conversation Jesus had with a woman at a well. The woman was longing for something more too. And she didn't always know what it was. But Jesus at least gets us to see a part of it. In John chapter 4, verse 16 and 17, Jesus told her, go call your husband and come back. Well, I have no husband, she replied. And Jesus said to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. You have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true. Jesus is talking to this woman. He says, call your husband. She says, I don't have a husband. He says, you're right, but you've had 5, and the guy you're living with now is not your husband. Have you ever thought about that? This woman, she had 5 husbands and was living with another guy. Why would she do that to herself? Why? Seems to me she was longing for love. In the book, Finding Your Way Back to God, they talk about a man by the name of Glenn Wolfe. Glenn Wolfe, spelled exactly like my last name, Wolfe. I am not related to him that I know of. However, after you hear his story, you might think to yourself, we're all related to him. Because Glenn holds the record for the highest number of marriages in the United States. He has been married or was married 29 times. I don't know why he didn't get married one more time, at least round it up, 30. An even number and stop. 29 times. His shortest marriage was 19 days. His longest marriage was 7 years. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit about Glenn Wolfe. He was a Baptist preacher. 29 times. Wolfe's son, from his 14th marriage, when asked why his dad got married so many times, said, my dad was just picky. Now the truth is, I can't tell you if he was picky or not, but I can tell you that he wasn't satisfied. It appears to me that he was longing for love, but he kept looking for that fulfillment in people instead of in God. And the truth is, he should have known better. But so should all of us. By the way, just to tell you what happened to Glenn, Glenn died at the age of 89. He was penniless. He resided in a nursing home in California. And when he died, no one came to claim his body. I hear that story and I think to myself, how sad that is. If he would have just turned to the one that he claimed to be speaking for, he probably would have found the love he'd been looking for. See, God has shown us what love looks like. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 10, it says, this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. God reached out and he shows us what love looks like. We need to turn to him and find that love that truly fulfills our longing. There's a prayer that Paul prays. It's in Ephesians chapter 3. This is what he says. He says, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. He goes on. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Paul prays for the church. I pray that you can grasp this love that has been shown to you. I have the same prayer for the church. I pray that we can grasp this love that has been shown to us from God. God satisfies our longing for love. God also satisfies our longing for significance. Our longing for significance. How often have we asked, why am I here? And sometimes that is a follow-up question to, how did I get here? But how often do we ask, why am I here? I think that's exactly what the prodigal son found himself asking. Why am I here? As he's feeding the pigs, which would have been unthinkable to the Jews. Why am I here? As he's longing to eat their slop, which is unthinkable to all the rest of us. Why am I here? There has got to be more than just pleasure. There's got to be more than just filling my stomach. There's got to be more than just grasping for the brass ring, as it were. Have you ever been there? There's got to be more. Have you ever thought to yourself, there's got to be more to this life? There's got to be more for me? Wild living and prostitutes and parties just aren't cutting it for the prodigal. In my day, we would have said something like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But it's the same idea. This realization that there's no significance in those things. They're going to let you down. According to NBC, Michael Phelps, the most decorated Olympian of all time, was arrested while driving under the influence in 2014. Now, this is what he said. He said, I sent myself down a downward spiral. I think it was more of a sign than anything else, that I had to get something under control, whatever it was. I look back at that night and everything happened for a reason. He then checked himself into a rehab soon after that arrest. And he says, I was at the lowest place I've ever been. Honestly, I sort of at one point, I felt like I didn't want to see another day. I felt like it should all be over. And then he added, I think I was at a point in my life where something needed to change, and I needed to figure out what those things were. And according to an ESPN profile of Phelps, in the treatment that he had sought out, Phelps earned the nickname of Preacher Mike, because each day he began with a chapter of The Purpose-Driven Life, a book that had been given to him by former Baltimore Ravens linebacker and good friend Ray Lewis. And Phelps every day shared the lessons with the others in that program as he was learning them for himself. And according to ESPN, Phelps called Lewis and he said this. He said, man, this book is crazy. The things that's going on. Oh my gosh, my brain, I can't think. Thank you enough, man. You saved my life. Phelps started his journey out of depression and self-destruction by coming face to face with the idea that God has purpose for him. He started to come out of all of that by realizing that God has purpose for him. Now keep that in mind, because in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, it says, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. I love that verse because God communicates we are His masterpiece, as some versions say. When we come to God, He reworks our life. He takes all the broken pieces and He and He doesn't just put them back together like they were. He puts them back together better than they ever could have been. And He makes us significant and special. Not just a piece of art to hang on a wall, but but a person to be involved in changing a world. The prodigal goes back to his father with this mindset in mind. He thought to himself, I'll just beg my father to let me be a servant. But the father restores him to the place of honor as his son. When we turn back to God, we do serve the world, but we don't serve them just as servants. We serve them as children of God, as an important part of His family. We have significance and purpose in God's kingdom. If you haven't already guessed it, that 19-year-old was me. And realizing that running away from home didn't satisfy the longings, only when I finally began to run back to God did I find satisfaction. Only when I finally ran back to God did I find love. Only when I finally ran back to God did I find significance. C.S. Lewis is one of my favorite authors. In Mere Christianity, he writes this. He says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. In other words, everything this world has to offer, they pale in comparison to what God has to offer. God is the real thing. And He invites you and me to come and see.